Okay, I think we are right on time and we can start. In this session, we are going to be chatting about the security of Kubernetes and cloud-native environment. We are, before starting, really just a couple of housekeeping rules. We are going to discuss for about 60 minutes. We'll start with a discussion with our panelists, with some chat about the topic, but we'll address any question our audience has. So feel free to ask questions whenever they come to you. Don't just wait to post them in the chat at the last minute. Just feel free to ask questions, and I'll pass them on to today's speakers. Finally, I would like to just thank Cisco for sponsoring this session. And before we introduce today's panelists, I would like just to give a couple of words about today's topic, security of Kubernetes and cloud-native environment. With the advent and rapid evolution of cloud-based solution, the Kubernetes, I think, has been, is the dominant force at the moment in orchestrating containerized application. And so is a key part, when we think about security, is a key part we need to think about. So today we are going to discuss about what are common mistakes in security Kubernetes cluster, what are best practices, and almost all, when you start, what can you do? Where should you start? What are the defaults good enough, or should you change something? Is there any tool that's going to make your life easier? Well, we'll try basically to understand in 1 hour what we can do, what is the next step in our security journey. So without taking any other time for our speakers, my name is Renato Losio. I'm principal architect at Funable. I'm an editor here at infoq. And I'm joined today by 3 great experts. I'll give them the words. Unfortunately, William should be joined with us today. It's not last minute, couldn't make it. So I start giving the chance to each one of our speakers the chance to introduce themselves and basically as well give our audience the idea where you are in your journey with security and Kubernetes. I will start with Jacopo, if you want to give a couple of words about yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Renato, for your introduction. My name is Jacopo Nardiello. I'm the founder and CEO of SIGAP. We are a scale-up based in Milan. We are an Italian company. We work mainly in Europe, and we're focused on Kubernetes adoption within the enterprise, open source Kubernetes. We are focused on the upstream side of the cloud-native environment. And how it can be used efficiently within large organizations. That's mainly what we do. And of course, right now we are in the moment where Kubernetes is reaching day 2 sort of life, right? So we already have our clusters, now what? And of course, security is a big topic into that overall discussion, right? And that's pretty much who I am.
Christina, do you want to be next?
Yes, sure. Thanks again, Renato, for the introduction. So hello, everyone. My name is Kristina Devochko. I'm based in Oslo, Norway. And when it comes to my role, it's always hard to say because it's like I do a lot of different things as part of my work, but I call it for a software architect. In Norway, we have a term called potato, where you do like a lot of different tasks. But I'm working a lot with Kubernetes, both on my at work and also as part of my personal community contributions, and especially with the managed Kubernetes service like Azure Kubernetes service provided by Microsoft, for instance. And I have always been interested in security since I started my career in IT as a developer. And when there was kind of an essential transition when we started working with Kubernetes as part of my job. And I think it's a huge topic when it comes to the Kubernetes ecosystem, and there is a lot of important and also fun topics to touch upon. So I'm looking forward to a great discussion today.
Thank you, Christina. Michael?
Hey, thanks, Renato. I am Michael Chenitz. I work for Outshift at Cisco, but don't think of Cisco as like this networking only company. I have nothing to do with networking. So I have, really what we do is we look at the cloud native technologies, and we have, yes, we do. We have cloud native technologies that are around cloud native application protection and things around Istio and Kafka. But really, the reason why I'm really interested in this is because I tend to think about all of the people getting into cloud native, the people that are thinking of, hey, I have to take this legacy application and turn it to microservices. And I have to think about like all of the different elements that are needed in order to get this application up and running. And developers, we know, because I'm one of them, is made for speed, meaning that you have to get this application out the door. What you're not thinking about when you're told that you have to get to microservices is this aspect of security. That's kind of an afterthought. So and if you look at the cloud native,
really come to that because you already raised very good.
Yeah, and when you look at the cloud native, the CNCF is great, but it's also overwhelming. So you have 5,000 different things on the landscape, and you're thinking about, well, how do I maintain? How do I secure this? So there's a lot of this kind of stress, and really, it's kind of a good spot. I don't know if you want to start here, but it's a great spot to kind of start talking about the why we're here.
Thank you, Michael. Actually, that's a very good point. As the audience of infoq Live is mainly senior software engineer and architect, I'd like really to start with probably already partly answered. That is, what do you consider a pain point today? I mean, I have a Kubernetes cluster on the cloud or wherever I want to have it. From a security point of view, what do you see as the main pain point? I think Michael just mentioned the too many options, too many things, and hard to decide, how to manage. I don't know, Jacopo, I see you shaking a bit your head. I don't know if you have any feeling. What do you consider the pain point right now?
So the whole point is that it's such a complex topic. What do you mean? What do we mean by security? Do we mean threat analysis? Do we mean artifacts management, software bill of materials? Do we mean runtime security, secrets management? How do we run our builds and our pipelines? These are all challenges. And this is not even to mention the regulation part, right? Certifications and right now in Europe we have the how's it called, the CRA, which is the new act from the European Union, basically holding accountability on open source software for whatever weak, they introduce in your software. It's a very, very complex topic.
Thank you, Jacopo. Christina, do you have anything to add? I see you nodding yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is totally quite an extensive and complex topic. Like, we hear a lot about the complexity of Kubernetes and Kubernetes ecosystem, and you have that landscape that Michael mentioned. There are some great memes out there about you like watching that infographic of CNCF landscape and you are close to getting a heart attack, right? So what are you gonna choose? And then if it's also the change in the mindset, right? How are you thinking about containers? How are you thinking about orchestrators like Kubernetes? That's not the same like working, for instance, purely with VMs. So understanding also that kind of layered approach and how the changes you make in your software, for instance, in that software development lifecycle, can affect the security posture of, for instance, your Kubernetes clusters where those apps are running. All of those can become a pain points, especially in the beginning of your adoption journey. So getting those helpers, some frameworks that could help would also really be important to be aware of, to not make it more complicated than it should be, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that a little bit, I mean, there's a couple things I always think about. One is that, first of all, is Kubernetes the right solution? You shouldn't be thinking about initially your platform. You should be thinking about the needs of the application. What are the needs of the application? Break it down. Do you need microservices? Do you need that at all? Maybe even, and if you do, maybe something like WASM, depending on what your needs are, figure out your needs first. Do you need redundancy? Do you need a way for your developers to kind of work on things by themselves and then bring it together at the end? You may need microservices. I'm not saying you don't, but what you shouldn't do is just say, hey, I'm going to pick a platform and design for it. That's the wrong way in my mind, of kind of doing this. But once you have decided on that, then you should start to think about, okay, well, how do I design this in a way that's going to scale, that's going to be secure, and that we can manage? Now, unfortunately, with things like Log4j, we've seen that supply chain's an issue. We've seen that there's a lot of issues that come into play when you're using all these. The good thing and the bad thing about developers is that, and I can say this again because I do the same thing. So I'm definitely doing what I'm stating. So we tend to go for the easiest API that's going to get something done. We don't think about the ramifications of that until afterwards. We're like, hey, the application's good. We've done it. It's built. It's working. I put it in this cool thing called Kubernetes. All right, I'm going to bring it to prod. No, you're not. Have you thought about, all these different ramifications? And really, the developer, we can't put the onus on them to be the security experts. It's not the same domain knowledge.
Point, Michael, but that's actually what the next question I had myself was like, I'm a developer. I joined this roundtable. It's all very cool, but I'm building my application. Yes, I might have to use Kubernetes, but is even my problem? I mean, as a developer, as an architect, what is the barrier? I know the entire concept of shift left, but it's like you might, with all these things, all these concern, and as Jacopo mentioned before, the security means many different things, is what should I care about? Can I even just say, well, I put my head under the sun and I don't care about anything. Security is not my fault. And I know that's incorrect. So, for example, Jacopo, where do you see as a developer the goal? I mean, I know there are 10,000 different ramifications, but if I start today with Kubernetes, what should I really do as a developer?
So as a developer, I would say that the bare minimum is to have a little bit of ownership on the Kubernetes primitives when it comes to security. Have an idea of what RBAC is, have an idea of how to manage your policies, how to, what does it mean to use Kubernetes in a sort of a secure way? So know your tool. If you want to be aware of Kubernetes, sometimes you just don't want to care about it, right? Sometimes you just run it, and I don't want to know how you run it, and that's topic. These are all topics for someone else, but still, I think that as a developer, you need to be aware of these basic things, right? And then the other key thing, which is not really Kubernetes related, is be aware of your dependencies. That's a big thing, right? And by the way, your operative system is a dependency. So it's, and all the libraries within it are a dependency. And so, especially when it comes to containers where, yes, we have the kernel running stuff, and then you as a developer pick what's the base image that you're going to use. You need to be aware of the choices that you're doing. So I would say that, yes, dependencies and basic stuff like policy management and RBAC are the things where I would focus, that I would say any developer should know, right? They don't need to be expert into other things which are more like specialized, but at least this stuff, they should be, they should take it seriously.
Tina nodding. Do you
Me?
want to?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that it really, when it comes to developers, it really depends on how the organization is set up, like how your teams are operating. I have been in projects where developers were directly involved with, for instance, Kubernetes, because, for example, they didn't have a dedicated platform team due to different constraints, and you have teams that are like more mature, that they have a dedicated team maintaining, administering those Kubernetes clusters. But I think the silver line there is that for you as a developer, it's important to understand like the fundamentals of Kubernetes, what it is, what are containerization, orchestration technologies. But I think it's also important to be aware of the policies that and the gateways that will be set in case you have others ensuring the security and reliability, for instance, of the workloads and of the Kubernetes clusters. So in case you do a misconfiguration and you will be stopped due to the automated gateways, you need to be prepared for this, that you will need to check it out and follow up and take the responsibility for the service you're developing. And many teams do have a responsibility for building those containerized applications. So they have a responsibility for ensuring that the container image is hardened, secured, you're using the Slim base image and all that stuff. So kind of understanding how to do that and having the dialogue with eventually Kubernetes cluster administrators, if you have those, would be important to ensure that they can help to reduce that cognitive load on you. And since Michael mentioned Log4j, I also want to mention one thing, which is kind of something I really, really always want people to remember when you kind of start working with supply chain, wherever. Don't use the wildcard, don't use the latest version, because let's say in Kubernetes, you have different clusters, but you have a single source code base where you define the latest version, and those clusters are being deployed, provisioned at different points in time. And then you may end up using different versions of the same library in case you're using latest, because a new release could have come out. And with Log4j, I've seen that pain trying to get that overview of, oh my God, which version do I actually have of that library in which cluster? That is not easy if you have the latest as part of your source code definition, right? So understanding that and using a specific version could also be an important step, a quite easy one to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to whose responsibility is it, though? You know, it's funny. I had Kelsey Hightower the other day on my show, and we were chatting about this, and he's like, well, you wouldn't take like a plumber and tell him to do electrical work. It's not like, you know, it's so you want to. I love the way he always phrases stuff, because it makes it so much easier to think about stuff, you know. And that might not have been the exact phrasing, but it was something like that. And really, the key is you have to think of the main objective. The main objective of designing these applications is usually, for a business, is profit. So you want to make sure that your development is not coming off the track. So yes, the developers need to do secure coding. Yes, they need to do stuff that's in their domain. But really, we want them to still be doing development. And so that means that we have to start to enable other processes, other tools, other things to do, to kind of to have a framework and to keep them on track and make sure it's checking for things like supply chain and all these other kinds of CVEs and things like that. So that's what I would just leave it at as that.
Thanks, Michael. My point is, I fully get the part as well about Log4j example, but as a developer, I feel like that applies as well if I don't use Kubernetes. So I understand that there's nothing really specific for Kubernetes. Like, I know that the distributed architecture of Kubernetes can make it worse. What I'm thinking is there any specific on Kubernetes that, in terms of, for example, vulnerabilities that we should, as a cloud specialist, think about? I don't know if you want to answer or.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll just say one thing on that, and that is that actually the Kubernetes webpage has a really, really good overview of cloud native security. And they talk about like the 4 C's of cloud native security, which is code, container, cluster, and cloud, or colo, or corporate data center. They wanted to keep with the C, obviously, there. So they have a really good page that talks about each of the different kind of configuration options and things that you should consider in cloud native security. And really it comes down to, and this is what I always think about, is that the containers within Kubernetes and parts of Kubernetes are designed to be open by default. And that's because they want people to be able to run their applications. People would complain and say, hey, our application's not working, and there would be a lot more tickets, there would be a lot more problems, and it wouldn't be adopted as well. So it's by default very open, and there are things that you need to do to kind of lock it down. So that's and we could discuss that here, but that's the key there.
That's really the key. So as a person starting to play with Kubernetes, what are the first we are saying, okay, so the default is open. So what are my first step in the direction to secure my Kubernetes cluster? I don't know if Jacopo, you want to give some advice or?
I would leave the topic to I don't. It's such a
wide.
Yeah, it is really, I would like to get a little bit deeper. I'm also reading the comments, some of the comments that are coming. It's just, there are so many aspects that you need to take care of. So whenever you run Kubernetes, right, and whenever you run stuff on top of your Kubernetes cluster, it would be easy, for us to say just use our managed Kubernetes. That's going to take away some of the aspects. But again, it's just, running clusters, it's one of the aspects. There are so many other things that you need to take care of. So it's, I don't know.
You mentioned something actually interesting. In terms of managed Kubernetes, I think the word managed Kubernetes already came up a couple of times in terms of cloud offering. Really thinking about security, what are the advantages you see in adopting managed solution, whatever is AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud, versus basically do it yourself?
So I'm kind of an expert on this topic. So, yeah. Because we maintain our own distro. So it's running Kubernetes on-prem, it's a big topic for us. It's the key difference is that whenever you have a managed Kubernetes, beside the complexity of running Kubernetes itself, you get some sane pre-configuration sort of, and some enhanced features that that are abstracted away by the provider. That's definitely the key benefit, right? Still, you need to be aware of the stuff that you do. As an example, right? By default, you might have public control plane. So you need to be aware that shouldn't be the case in case you're running like production workloads. So it's it's a double thing. The fact that they are abstracting away some of the complexity, making it more accessible, it's truly a benefit. On the other hand, it does not really take away the fact that you should be aware of what you do. And of course, if you run stuff by yourself on your own, whatever infrastructure, it could also be EC2 instances, right? So just VMs or VMs on your provider, and you take care of everything. You need to take care of everything. So it's nothing comes for free. It's a trade-off. It's there's no simple answer to that.
Michael, I see you nodding.
Yeah. Well, again, to go back to, there's two different things. There's the actual like Kubernetes infrastructure that you have to maintain. If you're going to do that yourself, obviously there is that Kubernetes page, which we could link and maybe show people at some point. But the managed services, the great thing about using a managed service versus that is that there are preset templates, preset security, preset ways for you to handle those things. When you're doing it yourself, then you have to think about certain things. You have to think about the infrastructure layer. So you have to be kind of a domain semi-expert in multiple things. One thing is infrastructure, which is like network access, things like that, access.cd. You have to be an expert in containers. So things like container vulnerability, image shining, using container runtimes, all those kinds of things. Also the workload security. So you're getting down to these different levels that you need to be experts in. So if you're doing it yourself, you have to have a lot more of that knowledge. And if you're doing it in a managed, they have that knowledge for you. So it's a lot easier, you don't have that barrier for entrance if, to go into the cloud provider versus your on-prem. I mean, if we wanted to, we could talk a little bit more about, some of the on-prem things that you really need to think about and how you handle those things.
Absolutely. I'm interested about that. And one thing I wanted to mention, as you mentioned before, in terms of links or whatever, feel free to share links in chat if you think there are links that are useful for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I can do that. Yeah.
Christina, do you want to add anything on top? I know you're
the
Azure ecosystem.
I'm coming from the also from the consumer perspective, so I can say that you do not only need to maintain multiple things like control plane, which is kind of the operation center. It's the crucial component of Kubernetes. So you need to ensure that it is redundant, available, secure, because everything in terms of your workloads depends on it. But I would think that you would also need multiple resources to be able to handle all of these components, because you don't want to be the only one handling that. And also it requires much more from you to do that does not come out of the box, which means that you would need more people to ensure that it's production ready. In terms of managed Kubernetes service, cloud providers do invest quite a lot into also into the security aspect of things. So there is quite to quite a high extent, you get some security controls from them out of the box. For instance, in terms of the infrastructure, the servers that those Kubernetes nodes are running on, and the control plane as well, which can help, especially if you don't have that hardcore production experience with running bare metal Kubernetes servers. And you mentioned earlier, Renato, like for a new developer or an architect who would like to understand the security aspect of Kubernetes, I think it's important to mention that if you are going for a managed Kubernetes service on cloud, I think it's important that you start from the security benchmark that the cloud provider has for their managed Kubernetes service, because going through that information will give you an understanding of what security, how the clusters are configured by default when you start them up. So for example, if we think about Azure Kubernetes Service, it has less secure configurations enabled by default, because the strategy overall is to make it easier and faster for consumers to start playing around with it. So for instance, the API server is enabled and publicly available by default. So you would know that by checking that documentation where it says step by step for every layer what is coming by default and what you would need to do to secure it more, to harden it more, and what kind of limitations it has. If you go for a private cluster, which is only available privately through private IPs and all that, then it does have some limitations in terms of like build agents and how you're having all the CI/CD flow in place. So I would not underestimate the security benchmarks that you would need to check as the foundational place to start of getting an understanding of the Kubernetes offering you're opting in for.
Thank you, Christina. Michael, I see you.
Yeah, one other thing I would just, one other aspect of this that you have to consider is the human aspect too, because we're in a time where there's a lot of shifting employment and things like that. And honestly, the person that you have that's going to manage this internally might be way different that, might not be the same person that's going to manage it in the future. So if you do it in the cloud versus doing it yourself, you might have a better chance of continuing the management of that. So that's one aspect of it. And the other thing is that there's different skill sets. There's different skill sets to manage a cloud provider's kind of ecosystem versus managing it on-prem. And, so that could lead to more security kind of drift, because you have to know a little bit different domain knowledge in order to do one versus the other, I would say.
Thank you, Michael. Actually, I wanted to shift 1 second the topic. I had a very big person who was Kubernetes plugins. How do you handle them in terms of security? Is that as scary as it sounds? As scary as you read about? Or
if I may, Renato, what do you mean by Kubernetes plugins? I mean, are we talking about operators? Are we talking
operators? I was thinking mainly operators.
They're pieces of software, right, that use the event-based system internal of Kubernetes, to handle the state of pieces of infrastructure. They are very complex. They can be as complex as, they can contain arbitrarily complex logic within themselves. And so it's, is it scary as it sounds? I don't think it's as scary as it sounds in terms of there's Kubernetes sort of providing you some common framework and common layer of logic that you can rely on. But again, you can embed whatever you want within them. So yes, they're just another piece of software that you're running within Kubernetes, and you need to be aware of that. They are complex. In general, I agree that they are complex. So you need to be aware of what you're doing. Okay, it's a few years ago we had this operator craziness. It was, operators were like the cool thing to do, and they were just, they just got started. So I think that right now they're getting a little bit more mature. In general, they are a super powerful pattern. They allow you to use the control feedback loop of Kubernetes within your other pieces of infrastructure. Yeah, but again, they might introduce some complex logic. So yeah, better if they are supported by someone, if you have to run them, in prod, or you have the sufficient level of skills to handle them.
Yeah, I just go back to one thing, and that is, managing your supply chain, because really what it comes down to is that every piece of software that you're running, whether it be in a container, or reaching out to an API, you have to think about, what is that built of? So if you're running more operators, you're running more things within your system. And that should be considered as part of that, because of the fact that, it's additional things to manage. It's additional things that are going to have, that have different images and different, different components in there. And when you have that, then you're increasing kind of that attack surface, because you potentially, not always, but potentially increasing that. So you have to make sure that you really need that operator. A lot of times, like what we mentioned before, is that people went operator crazy. We went from Helm, then we went to operators, and everything was operators. And honestly, not everything needs to be an operator. And so really think about what needs to be in there. What function does it have? Do you need to maintain a life cycle of something? Then you may need to use an operator. But if there's a simpler way of doing it where you don't need to maintain a life cycle, then you probably don't need an operator. It comes down to that.
I would like to go back to when in the beginning we were saying that there are common mistakes in securing a Kubernetes cluster. I would like to start to give some kind of advice, action item, and what do you see as for example, best practice for least privilege, secret management, or whatever you think is important in terms of securing your cluster. Do you want to start from there, keeping it to?
Yeah, sure. So I think the keys here is, first of all, don't allow privileged access if you don't need it. That's first and foremost. So a lot of people just by default just allow that, and that's going to open up doors to everything. Role-based access control, make sure you use that. A lot of people run things as the default, Kubernetes user and administrator, and honestly, that shouldn't be the way that you run things. So, but it is the way that people come out the door. So a lot of these simple things, I mean, that's two, and I'll let some other people, chat about it, but those are the two biggest things that I think right out the door you should take a look at. If we had to take two things away, those are the two things that I think are key. And we could start to talk about some of the littler things too, but yeah, network policy, between all the microservices, make sure you're only communicating what you need to communicate. Outside world, what are you using as a load balancer? What are you using as, for your inbound network? Are you using a service mesh? If so, how is that configured? So there's a lot of things to consider, and really what it comes down to least privilege. You want to make sure that you provide the least amount of privileges needed to run your application. If you're doing that, you're on a good, you have a good start.
Thank you, Michael. Christina, I know that you mentioned already something before when you were talking about managed cluster, but I wanted to check if you have any other advice to give in this session.
Yeah, I think maybe Michael mentioned quite a few great pinpoints, like least privilege principle in this case is kind of a silver line. Of course, what we mentioned about the API server, ensuring that you don't need to have that broad, unnecessary threat vector in place, even though it just returns, for instance, unauthenticated or 401 error code, it still gives an attacker some kind of information that they can work further with. So thinking about what you can do with this, can you introduce IP ranges to begin with? And or could you use like a private cluster in itself? And here I think it's important also to take it step by step, taking one kind of step at a time, implementing it, seeing how it works, and if anything breaks, and if you need to follow the top, and not trying to implement everything at the same time. In terms of RBAC, what is good with managed Kubernetes service is that you can kind of use the RBAC solution that is provided by the cloud provider. Like in terms of Microsoft Azure, you could integrate it with Azure AD. What is good about this is that you could limit the roles and the permissions every user has in the cluster to the bare minimum that they need in terms of doing their job. Once again, least privilege. You could implement just-in-time access for those who need just-in-time access there and then to do something, to check something. So this is kind of a good advantage for the managed Kubernetes service. Network policies obviously are important because namespaces do not provide isolation by default, and this is also a misconception that has been there for a while. By default, all namespaces, workloads in all namespaces in the cluster can communicate freely with each other, so you would need to restrict that with help of network policies or like service mesh that can provide you this capabilities in an easier way in some cases. So yeah, and there are like, once again, all those security frameworks that are there should be used as a checklist for you, as a cheat sheet. Like even OWASP top 10 for Kubernetes is a great start. It gives you checklist, exactly. Check this. This is the way you can fix it, for example, by using security context on the pods and containers to ensure that they are not running as root. So here are some of the like examples and pinpoints to think about. So yeah, I see that I can derail a lot if I start going like step by step, but these are kind of the first things to check, and maybe to make it easier, you could start by implementing some tool that can actually flag these things for you and kind of make it easier to get an overview of what you need to get in place.
Sorry, Renato, if I may,
right, sure.
If I may connect to what Christina was just mentioning, another great framework that I feel like mentioning is the NIST. So that the NIST is providing great guidelines into how to secure containerized workloads. And they are pretty broad. They're not just strictly related to, I mean, Kubernetes is one of the key aspects, but it's not the only key aspect. If I also, so I just wanted to mention the NIST for the audience, whoever is listening, just go check it out. They provide a great, even introductory document. It's a great place where to start. The other things I wanted to mention, so Michael and Christina, they gave like a great overview into the, some of the key important things that you need to take care of. I may add some others, or I may elaborate a little bit. So the very first thing I would do is so someone in the comment or in the QA, they were mentioning pod security policies or OPAs.
If you wanted to address that question, thank you.
Exactly. So Open Policy Agent is a key element that I would definitely integrate into all production clusters. There are alternatives like Kyverno. Just define your policies as code, and define what it means for your organization to run. What is acceptable to your organization. Like Michael was mentioning, avoid the whole privilege escalation part, or avoid running root, containers as root, or this kind of stuff. These can all become policies code that you can actually embed within your cluster. So the clusters, they will become aware of what it means to be secure and what is a secured workload. Another thing I want to mention is sign your containers. So there is a SIG-Store whole initiative, implement cosign within your clusters. So make sure that you run signed workloads and not just random stuff that you just, find on the internet, sort of. Make sure that what you run is what you built. It's not to be taken for granted. Christina was mentioning service meshes. Definitely. These are they will give you basic stuff like mutual TLS and, basic observability within your clusters. So invest into that. These are all expensive topics, meaning that they still require you to put effort into it, but these are all very actionable things and very practical projects that you should definitely onboard within your clusters. Okay, and that's not even to mention the whole ingresses, how you secure your ingresses, or how you put firewalls behind, your how you expose your services. Right, that's another key topic. It's related to service meshes, but not only. So it's these are all the things that I feel like mentioning.
Thank you, Jan. Actually, you mentioned something that I found interesting was the topic of securing as well container images. I don't know if it's something that someone wants to cover as a developer, what I'm supposed to do, or
if I may add something to that, and I don't want to take if Michael and Christina, this is a topic which is very close to my heart, meaning that it's the typical topic which is mostly ignored 90% of the times, that people are using, whoever are using Kubernetes clusters, they're just, I will just take whatever from the Docker Hub and, and run it from there. And it's such a core thing, right? So make sure to use sane, good base images. This is you can invest as much as you want into policies code, into service meshes, into operators, whatever, but if you are using an image which has Bitcoin D running within it, it's a problem, right? And so right now, I think that also we are at a turning point when it comes to secure base images, meaning that there is a lot happening with SIG-Store, cosign. ChainGuard is doing amazing work into that, right? So with Wolfie and distroless images, I feel like mentioning them. If I may do a little plug, we have our own secure containers catalog from SIGAP. But the whole point is that make sure to use images which are sane. And by sane, I mean maintained somehow, because sometimes they are just not maintained. So, and that's the very first thing. Second thing is they run with good defaults. So rootless, mostly, and then with good best practices. And what these best practices are, it depends on the workload that you're running. So it's
I can maybe pitch in here to what Jacopo mentioned regarding trusted base images. I think also it's important to mention opting, if you can use the slimmest, the minimal base image that is out there, because many providers of those base images have different options that you can choose from. So kind of being aware of what kind of image you go for, not just choose the one that is there by default, but evaluating, okay, can I use the minimal image? Does it have enough there for me to run my application on? Because it has multiple benefits in terms of security, that you don't run what you don't need as part of that image. So the attack surface is being reduced. And also in terms of resource requirements, it will be more lightweight when there is less packaged into that image. So this is also a benefit. And also looking into both in terms of trusted registries, thinking about what registries you're pulling the images from, will also be a benefit in terms of security, of course.
Yeah, I would just add one more thing, and this is all about repeatability. You don't want to do any of this stuff manually. You want to make sure that you set up a pipeline that checks for these things. So you're creating this application. It has all these microservices. It's going to pull down Docker images. You want tools that can check those images and the layers in those images for things like CVEs and other things like that. You also want to check that software supply chain, you want to check, SBOMs and all these other things. You want to make sure that everything is good before it goes into production. So you don't put something into production until it's verified as known good, and it has to be repeatable. None of this stuff is manual. We have tools, and this is where you won't think Cisco plays, but we have tools that we have open source tools that will help with API security, with Kubernetes security, with data security, all these other things. And we also have a full cloud native application protection suite, which you could just say, hey, look, let's check the policies. Let's check the Kubernetes policy. Let's check the APIs for vulnerabilities. Let's check all these things. So the point is that this doesn't have to be, none of this is manual. You can actually automate a lot of this stuff. So find the tool that works for you and make sure to implement and kind of automate out all of this stuff, all of these best practices, all of these things, and leave the code for the coders, and make sure that you trust that automation that's going to check for all these various things.
One thing I wanted to mention, because I forgot that. Sorry, Michael. I think it's important just to also mention one thing in terms of building container images and in terms of using the root user. I think it's important also to have in the back of your head that there are still many base images that come with a root user that runs that container by default. So there are providers of those images that can offer an unprivileged version. Like, for instance, Nginx has two different offerings, where they have one that is Nginx unprivileged and one which is regular. That one will run with root user by default. This also kind of drills back to like the ports that are being exposed and which user is allowed to use them, but kind of being aware of that and looking into if you can use an unprivileged base image offering, or in some cases you may need to do something when you build your image. You may need, in some cases you can override it. You can do some workarounds like with .NET images, where you could still override it and use a different user to run your containers. But just knowing about that is important. And also like open policy agent and policies you can enforce will also help you flagging the containers that are running with a root user. So just keep it in the back of your heads as well.
One more thing too I would mention is that this isn't a one and done for base images. The images are constantly changing. So there are tools like I have friends at Slim AI and some of these other places that constantly monitor the images and check for those vulnerabilities. And honestly, it is one of the most important things that you can do. So I agree with everything that everybody's saying here, but definitely be consistent with these things.
I think Christina before mentioned the topic of distribution that are basically streamed down to the basics to run as a container. So the less packages you have is not just faster, but as well is more secure as well. And of course, in that sense as well, cloud provider go in that direction. But I was wondering if there's any recommendation, because if I'm on a cloud, okay, I tend to stick to the distribution of the specific cloud provider, whatever is the Linux distribution of Amazon 2 or whatever else I'm using. I was wondering from your side, when I'm instead running my own cluster, what do you recommend? Do you have any specific recommendation for a specific use case and so on? Michael?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, there's depending on the provider that you have. I mean, we mentioned like, we mentioned things like Wolfie and things like that. And, and there's Slim AI, there's a bunch of different ways to kind of get that great base image. But the key is to keep it slim, to make sure that you understand what's in it. Don't just pull something down. but yeah, I mean, there's so many that you can go for, you know, and that's why I don't want really, I'm hesitant to like recommend one because it's still like a space that's kind of emerging.
I see a question in chat, or more a statement than a question. It would be good if Kubernetes could stop the container runtime if it doesn't pass a security health instance check according to a predefined ruling profile. Does anyone want to cover that? Jacopo?
I'm not sure what Omar means. I mean, the kubelet is just a process, the container runtime as well. So it's unlikely that this, you know, what he suggests could happen. At least not that I know of. With policy management, OPA and stuff, you can establish what are the rules for the container runtime to actually execute a container, which is, I guess, what Omar means, you know, and what he wants to achieve. Meaning that if you have a compromised CRI container runtime, or if you have a compromised kubelet or whatever other components, it means that your host machine, the node, is compromised, and that's one level of, you know, security. Then you have what happens within the containers or escalations from containers to node. It's you know, for what it means to have security issues within the container, OPA policy management, it's your answer mostly. So you can define rules by which the CRI is going to execute, or the orchestrator is going to schedule your containers. If, you know, we're talking about node level runtime security, you have projects like, I think it's mandatory to mention projects like FICO, for example, or eBPF-based security tools. There are a bunch of them. FICO Security, it's open source CNCF upstream project that you can run within your nodes, which is going to perform runtime security checks. Two things that I feel like they're unrelated to the question of Omar, which I think we kind of answered. Two things that we did not mention, which are also very important. First one, dynamic secrets management. That's something, you know, super
very good
relevant. You can't inject, you can bake passwords within your images, within your containers. You shouldn't do that, right? So they need to be injected dynamically. How you do that? Again, bunch of tools, more or less enterprise-ish, more or less upstream, more or less open source. That's the very first thing. And then there was another thing which I forgot. It will probably come.
I stop you there because I have actually, you mentioned twice the word tools in the last sentence, in the last couple of sentences. The first one mentioning about FICO for security, and the second one was a bunch of tools again. I actually wanted to go to that step, was what are open source tools or tools in general that can help me, and that would you recommend? That I know it's a wide spectrum, but if you had to suggest one tool, which one? I don't know, Christina, which one would you recommend to a developer?
Oh, one tool that is a bit of it. Can I mention two?
Sure.
Okay. I would like to mention the Trivy tool from Aquasec. I have used it for a while now, and I think it's quite good, and it can cover a lot of like checking both the container images for misconfiguration, and also the source code. I think you have a bunch of different functionality that you can configure in the tool to both do it as part of the CI/CD pipeline and also in the clusters itself. And I also want to mention Kubescape because it's a quite relatively new tool, you can say, but I really liked how easy it is to set up and how lightweight it is to just scan it towards the specific frameworks. Like I think it is scanning both the NIST framework, I think so, but it at least scans towards the NSA hardening guide for Kubernetes, which is also a very good framework to use. And what I really loved about it is that it can actually visualize the RBAC configurations in your cluster, which I think is pretty cool. So you could see like the whole connections between the different service accounts and role bindings and cluster role bindings, so that you could see who has permission to do what. Not sure if it's part. I think there are some limitations in terms of like how many nodes you could use in terms of utilizing that functionality. So you would need to check that. And for enterprise production settings, I think it may require a license. But just to start playing around with it and checking it out, I think you get quite a few nodes for free. So that would be my choices.
Thank you, Christina. Michael, before addressing that same question, I wanted to ask you if you want to cover, there's a question from the audience about secret management. The question is, why should we consider changing the secret management from the cloud provider to something like Vault or other way to store secrets? The default seems good enough.
Yeah, and I think that's a matter of preference, So there are some people that people tend to go towards what's easiest for them at that time. So and I think that's perfectly fine, by the way. So if you're on a cloud provider, it's always easier just to use the cloud provider. But if your needs change and you need to do something that's maybe hybrid or on-prem, you may need to use a different kind of secret solution, something like Vault. Vault is probably the most common. There's one that's like there's operators. If we go back to the operator, there's that open secret operator that manages some of that for you, still using things like Vault. But to go back, yeah, I mean, it really depends on your needs. So it's not one size fits all. And if you're going to go with the cloud provider, obviously that's the easiest way to do it. If you don't have a need to do anything else, don't do it. If you do have a need to do something else, then do it. It's a really easy answer, and I'm sorry about that, but that's really what it comes down to. There's not like a silver lining for it. It's just, it depends on how locked in you want to be towards a vendor and how much you need to have that that kind of openness to do other things.
Thank you, Michael. Jacopo, just you mentioned before, Falco, I was wondering if you have any other tool that because I didn't give you the chance to answer that question. So if you have any tool that you like to recommend for security, apart from what you already mentioned.
There are so many. Yeah. I mean, Kubernetes by itself, it will schedule stuff on your nodes. So everything else pretty much is a tool or sort of a tool, right?
That's an interesting way to see it. Yeah, that's actually interesting.
I don't know. I would say, again, OPA, that's we already mentioned that. It's nothing new. One tool I wanted to mention, so I actually wanted to connect to what Michael was saying regarding secrets management and stuff. I totally agree with him. It depends where you're running your stuff and what is your specific use case, right? Are you a big enterprise with an HSM? Probably then you need a more enterprisey solution like Vault or CyberArk or whatever else, right? Are you just on AWS? Just use or any other provider, just use whatever the provider is giving you. It's
Thank you, Jacopo. We have really, unfortunately, just a couple of minutes, so I really have time just for one last question, and I would like just to use it as actually question is, can you suggest, I know it's very hard, but one action item, something that as a developer I can do to improve the security of my Kubernetes deployment tomorrow? I mean, it can be reading an article, can be watching something, can be doing something, a checklist of any concrete one action item you would suggest. I start with Christina. Can be anything, can be a checklist you mentioned before.
Yeah, my thought before today was like the first action I would maybe recommend since I prefer learning by doing, if you're using a managed Kubernetes service, since it's so easy, I would suggest just enabling the policy management solution, just to start getting that overview of what you have configured. If you are not using, or if not, a more of a theoretical way to start with, I think is just checking the either the NIST framework that Jacopo mentioned, or I would really recommend OWASP, because it's really straight to the point in terms of concrete actions you can take.
Thank you, Christina. Jacopo? Anything?
I would not say
As I
anything.
mentioned.
Christina said what I wanted to say, so I'm totally aligned.
Thank you, Jacopo. Michael?
Sorry?
No, it's great. I mean,
you know, everything they said, but also there's a learning aspect of this. Make sure you understand what you're getting into. Make sure you understand what you have, and make sure you can visualize it. So use tools. I'm a big fan of, by the way, there's a tool called Monocle, which does baseline security, which does a bunch of other things. It's a newer tool. It's kind of like your IDE for everything that is Kubernetes, but it also provides scanning tools for those things, and it's open source. So I love it. Just know what you have. Go into it learning.
Thank you, Michael. Unfortunately, I've reached the time allowed for this session. Thank you for joining us today, discussing security of Kubernetes, and thank you to our three panelists. And just a word about the next KubeCon event in San Francisco, taking place in next October. And with that one, thank you to our audience. Thank you to everyone attending this roundtable, and see you soon. Thank you again, Christina, Jacopo, and Michael. Goodbye.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
The recording has stopped.